So, good morning. I want to welcome everybody to the beginning of our Psalm week with Psalm 79. Today's psalm is dedicated to Mimi Goldstein for both her love of learning and for her Parshat HaShavua stewardship, which focuses on both congregants teaching congregants primarily, but it's also exploring how what one is reading is relevant to themselves. So this psalm is dedicated to Mimi. Psalm 79, like all the psalms, calls on us to approach what we have as our shared legacy, three different perspectives. Namely, what was the perspective of the biblical writer? Two, what has been the classical rabbinic understanding of the psalm, which informs how our sages related to the words, which will be a key focus today, as you'll see. And the third is, how are these words meaningful to us, as if they were our song? Psalm 79 is most famous to many of us for words that are recited at our Passover Seder. Namely, verses 6 and 7 are two of four verses that we recite when we open the door after the meal and invite Elijah in for the fifth cup, the cup of Elijah. And when we invite Elijah in with the door open, we proclaim, pour out your fury on the nations that do not know you, upon the kingdoms that do not invoke your name, for they have devoured Jacob and destroyed his home. That will be verses 6 and 7 of this psalm. And then there's two additional verses. Pour out your wrath on them. May your blazing anger overtake them, which is Psalm 69:25. Pursue them in wrath and destroy them from under the heavens of Adonai, Lamentations 3:66. And so that's a moment that many of us know. A moment, if you look at the words, to feel a little perplexed by this rage. Pour out your rage, God, that has a history. And we'll come back to my talking about when those words entered the Haggadah. And for me, that is one of the facets of Psalms. Namely, how do verses from a psalm find their way into our collective memory, our collective liturgy? You'll see that also. I'll just point out that two other verses, that's verses 6 and 7. Verses 8 and 9 will be part of the daily, what's called tachanun, when you put your head on your hand and you do personal supplications as part of daily prayer. Verses 8 and 9, and the closing verse will be part also of daily prayer, both part of the evening prayers and each of the Amidah, the Modims, which is to say that verses from a psalm, this is average psalm, 13 verses, will be taken and used as part of Jewish ritual, and knowing the context in some cases adds meaning. One more thought, and then I'm going to put it up. This is another one of those Asaph psalms. And again, Asaph is quite remarkable in his poetic sensibility. He'll be paraphrasing and echoing lines from Bible often, as if he is with an audience that is not necessarily reading the text in the time of the Bible. It's an oral tradition. A lot of the words of the Bible are known by heart to the listeners, and therefore phrases, or if you will, echoes of the Bible take on creative use in such a psalm. And with that, let's look together at the words of Psalm 79. And again, I title the Psalms with a phrase from the Psalm. This one, pour out your rage at the nations. A Psalm of Asaph. God, nations have come into your inheritance. They have defiled your holy palace. They have laid Jerusalem into ruins. They have given the corpses of your servants for food to birds of the sky, the flesh of your devotees to the beasts of the earth. They poured out their blood like water around Jerusalem and no barrier. We have become a disgrace to our neighbors, a scorn and derision to those around us. Adma Adonai te'enaf lanetzach tivar kamo esh kinatecha. How long, Adonai, will you be angry forever, burning like fire your jealousy? Pour out your rage at the nations whom do not acknowledge you, and upon the kingdoms of whom you name, they do not call. For consumed is Jacob and laid waste his habitation. Do not recall to us former iniquities. Speedily advance toward us your compassions, for we have been brought very low. Help us, God of our deliverance, for the sake of your glory, of your name, and save us and forgive our sins for the sake of your name. Why should the nations say, Aye Elohehem? Where is their God? Let it be made known among the nations before our eyes, an avenging of blood of your servants that was poured out. Let come before you the groaning of the prisoner, as is the greatness of your arm. Release children of death, and return to our neighbors sevenfold into their bosom their disgrace, which they have disgraced you, my supreme, and we are your people, the flock of your tending. We will give thanks to you forever. From generation to generation, we shall tell your praise. And so now to do a little bit of the construction of the psalm, and then to focus on two interesting themes that I want to unpack. So I have to pace. One is when it says, do not make us suffer for the former sins. Are they referring to the sins of an earlier part of their own lives or for their ancestors? Meaning, is there suffering for the sins of one's parents in the Bible? That's an interesting question that you'll see emerge from a close reading. And then the second and maybe most important focus for me is, again, how do these verses get taken and used at a later time? So verses 6 and 7, pour out your rage at the nations, part of our Passover Seder. And how do we understand those words when we say them? Be it in the past, and maybe as prep, I saw somebody post that Passover is something like 90 days away now. So we're already beginning to prepare. So from the beginning, this psalm is divided into two parts. Verses 1 to 4 is a lament of a tragedy. We're not told in the psalm, and we've seen that in some cases in the past, like in the David Psalms, we're told of an event. We're not told what the event is here. Some say it was even as early as the Hasmonean suffering under the Syrian Greeks, but overwhelmingly, the commentators identify the tragedy as the destruction of the first temple. That, as described here, had blood flowing through the streets like water, verse 3. But more, the temple, the symbol of belonging, of purpose, of closeness to God, is laid to ruins. And the quality that's being described is the quality of not only is the lowest level of defilement, both of the sanctuary, but of human life. In Deuteronomy 21:23, Lo tavlin nivlato al ha'etz, you shall not let a corpse be dangling at night. It's to be buried. The greatest quality of lack of respect for life and by extension for God is an unburied body. And that we've heard that echo for enemies of the past in Psalms. May the birds eat them. In this case, here they are, the flesh of the devotees are being eaten and not buried in verses 2 and 3. And here's another key motif, and that is in verse 3, verse 2. These are the corpses of your servants, your chasidecha, your devotees, those who were loyal to you. In verses 2, verses 6, 9, and 10, there is the expression of being God's people, the ones who are identified with God's name. And so there's a quality of urgency for God to act. Verse 8, speedily advance. Verse 10, let this vengeance occur before our eyes. There's a sense here of a tragedy and urgency. We're not again told why. One step back and then I'll step forward, and that's the relationship to God, which I look to focus in on more this week. Over Shabbat, I was reading a book by Martin Buber, The Eclipse of God, in which Martin Buber addresses both Carl Jung in an exchange of letters and critiques Kant and Kierkegaard and others in terms of existentialism and philosophy, and talking about the reality of God being more than a psychological construct. And that's something I want to talk about with the 3 Psalms this week, is that for this psalmist, God is real. He's not talking to himself only. He's talking to a presence that he or she, but clearly in this time it's a he, identifies with justice and power, and first and foremost, a relationship of dependency that's 2 ways. People who are faithful to God depend on God's protection, but God depends on Israel for God's name to be praised, for God's name to be honored. And so beginning with verse 5, there is this plea to God. This is a conversation, a prayer to God. And I read it out loud in Hebrew because in Hebrew there's a cadence and even a rhyming. Ad ma Adonai, you can hear the plead. Te'enaf lanetzach, will your anger be forever? Tivar kamo eish kinatecha, burning like fire your jealousy. Now there is an echo. Deuteronomy 4:24, God's self-description. Ki Adonai Elohecha, because the ever-present one, your God, Adonai, your God, Eish Ochla, is a consuming fire. Hu El Kana, he is a jealous God. And so those qualities of burning, of jealousy, are again an echo of an identity from Torah. But this time, it's why is it burning against us? And now back in verse 7, for Jacob, and again, that's that, the Jacob is that of covenant. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You've destroyed both the people and the place. And I pause again, and again, I'm always grateful when Jack joins us to remind me as a child of Holocaust survivors, that we don't know the biblical moment for this quality of feeling so bereft. But for many of us, for all of us, for whom the Holocaust is part of our memory, either first or second hand or third hand, there is the sense of devastation that is the emotional context for these words. Okay, then verse 6 and 7 is the plea. Pour out your rage at the nations whom do not acknowledge you. Again, we acknowledge you. We are your servants. We are your pious ones. Not they. They don't call on your name. That's, again, the two-way street of relationship. I'll come back to 6 and 7. And now, verse 8. Do not recall to us former iniquities, avonot rishonim. Speedily advance toward us your compassions, for we have been brought very low. This question, are we punished for the sins of our ancestors, former iniquities? The commentaries are split over whether former is, do not recall to us our ancestors' iniquities, our early ones or forebears, or it's to be understood, this phrase, as do not recall to us our former iniquities. And that's, again, the nature of the poetry. Maybe both are true. Here's where there's a tension about this key theme. Do children get punished for the sins of their ancestors? In the Ten Commandments, we're told, you shall not bow down to other gods or serve them, for I, the Lord, the God, am a jealous God. Back to jealousy. Visiting the iniquity of parents on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but remembering those who love me to the thousandth. That can be understood poetically to be, I am a God of love, and my love far exceeds my sense of anger. Or it can be taken literally, which is, indeed, to the third and fourth generations, children suffer for the sins of their parents, which may be true in reality, meaning bad parenting leads to children having handicaps, in that sense, paying a price. That's a naturalistic explanation. But listen to these words from the book of Lamentations, 5:7. Again, words uttered in response to the destruction of the first temple. Avotenu chatanu ve'enam. Our parents, they sinned and are no more. Va'anachnu avanotehem savalnu. And we, for their sins, we should suffer? Now there it's a question, but it's in the context in the book of Lamentations of the possibility that there still is suffering of children for their parents. And again, I was just fascinated in this case with this word in verse 8 of Rishonim, the first. Is it our earlier sins or the sins of our ancestors? I did write a paper, if you're curious, on this whole topic of mamzerut. In the Bible, it says that a child born of an illicit sexual relationship is a pariah. And in writing that paper for the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards a number of years ago, I grappled with this question: should children be a pariah for nothing they did but for the sins of their parents? And there I cited, for instance, a statement from the prophet Ezekiel, who said, when the son has done what is just and right and has been careful to observe all my statutes, he shall live. The soul who sins shall die. This is Ezekiel 18, 19, and 20. The son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the father, nor the father suffer for the iniquity of the son. The righteous of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. And later, the rabbis of the Talmud, in parsing that verse I just read, for instance, of it's many places that God remembers the iniquity of parents to the third generation on the children, Deuteronomy 24:16, Exodus 34:7, Numbers 14:18, Exodus 25, Deuteronomy 5:9. The rabbis in the Talmud will parse it with Ezekiel echoing as well to say it's only when the children imitate the parents that ultimately everybody's responsible for their own choices, and God only punishes for one's own deeds. And so there is this quality, as modern scholars understand it, an evolving sensibility of children being punished and not. So let me pull this together so that we can focus now on those two key verses. But let me just go to the end. Help us, God of our deliverance. And again, Yishenu, that's the word in Hatzilenu, words of Exodus. Save us, forgive our sins for the sake of your name. Again, it's for your sake, God. Why should the nations say, where is their God? Let it be made known among the nations before our eyes, an avenging blood of your servants that was poured out. Let come before you the groaning. And that's again the image, the echoing of the Israelite slaves who groaned. Here some translate instead of prisoner, captives. For so many were taken captives in these destructions by the Babylonians and then later in time by the Romans. And once again, to pause, this is also read as a psalm of being in diaspora. Rabbi David Kimchi, Rabbi Ibn Ezra will say, Israel in exile is like a prisoner in jail. Verse 11, the groaning of the prisoner, as this psalm was read in exile, was read as relevant in each day, each generation. Return the greatness of your arm, Zroecha. That's again an image of Exodus, of God using Zro'an Nituyah, the outstretched arm, to bring the people to freedom. 12, return to our neighbors sevenfold into their bosom their disgrace, which they have disgraced you, my supreme. The image of sevenfold, Genesis 4:24, in reference to Cain, saying that hasn't he suffered sevenfold? And so 7 becomes endlessly. Let them suffer for the disgrace that they sought to bring on you. That's the argument that Moses makes to God after the golden calf. Even though we've sinned, for you to destroy your people would make you look bad in the eyes of the nations. For your sake, don't destroy us. And the last verse, verse 13, which again is part of our daily prayer, is set apart from the rest of the flow of the Psalms. We've seen that as not unusual. The language is also different. It's kind of an epilogue. And we are your people, the flock of your tending, that quality of God as shepherd and we being God's sheep. We will give thanks to you forever. From generation to generation, we shall tell your praise. And that is often the punchline in Psalms, and that is we're created in order to praise you. That's our purpose. So now the last piece, the refocusing on what is most familiar, this verse 6 and 7. Pour out your rage at the nations whom do not acknowledge you, upon the kingdoms of whom you name they do not call. The timing of reciting that in verse 7, for consumed is Jacob and laid waste his habitation, is at the end of the meal of the Seder, in which we open our door and we invite Elijah in. Elijah is the prophet who's going to proclaim a world of justice, a world in which God has re-entered history to enable the fulfillment of the promise of harmony. That's what Jews all the more in the generations of exile awaited as the call to return to the promised land. This paragraph that we're focusing in on only entered the Haggadah in the 11th or 12th century. Germany, during the time of the Crusades, according to most scholars. That was a time in which blood flowed, in which those who were on the way to redeem the promised land killed more Jews along the Rhine than they killed in the war necessary, according to some scholars, in Israel. You know, like the Jews were the ones who had forsaken the Lord, and they were killed. And with that, that quality of martyrology of entire Jewish communities like Mainz, Schum, the three cities of Germany along the Rhine, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, in which the communities were devastated, and which in so many cases it was an act of martyrdom, either convert or die, and they chose as communities to allow themselves to be sacrificed. So that's when this entered into the Haggadah. But of course it continued, it had a context and continued to resonate. In 1521, there was a manuscript that for some Haggadahs would later get put in, though it may have been, in fact, composed. Well, it's already in a manuscript from 1521, and that is the following, that got read immediately after, pour out your fury on the nations. Pour out your love on the nations who have known you and on the kingdoms who call upon your name. For they show kindness to the seed of Jacob, and they defend your people Israel from those who would devour them alive. May they live to see the Sukkah of peace spread over your chosen ones, and to participate in the joy of all your nations. And again, I pause to honor Jack, to say that Jack has been my teacher, to say that every survivor who survived had a non-Jew, a Gentile, who was an enabler of that survival. And that is part of this story of Jewish suffering as well. But back to this theme, and that is, how do we relate to these words? Do we relate to them simply as a memory of the past? Do we relate to them as a call of justice in an unredeemed world for all people? And the last comment in that regard, which you may have seen in the letter that I sent, and my letters are getting longer introducing the Psalms, but I was fascinated to find in one of my commentaries, and this is a book that I got only in recent months that's put out by Chabad, that often has commentaries of the Rebbe to the Psalms, in which he, post-World War II, is commenting on these verses. And he said, well, these verses, when it says, pour out your fury on the nations, it's only on those that do not acknowledge you. It's not to be an indiscriminate, it's only us that you care about. It's only those who don't acknowledge you that you are to bring to justice by pouring out your fury. And what's remarkable for me in his comment is that he didn't define who it is that acknowledges God on the basis of belief, but on the basis of action. And he says, in our time, countries tend to be kind. They tend to help others in need. They provide food. They provide care. That is not what verse 6 is not talking to the nations of our day. And I thought that was remarkable on both counts, that again, those who don't acknowledge you is not about belief, it's about action. And that where nations fulfill the 7 laws of Noah, this is according to traditional theology, which means that they are righteous in their deeds, then they are indeed worthy of the world to come. They are also to be judged as righteous. And so with that, I now turn it over to you for some reactions to pour out your wrath. Psalm 79. Let me get my copy here in front of me with my notes. And thoughts or reaction to today's psalm? Arnold, go ahead.
I've come to think that the greatest challenge to mankind is to overcome the tribalism that is hardwired into our nature.
Yeah.
And there's an aspect of it in this psalm where the psalmist says that the nations around us are in effect mocking us. It's another way of saying my God is greater than your God. And that has led to that's an aspect of tribalism, and it has led to it's one of the main contributors to wars, to pogroms, to whatever you name it.
So two thoughts in response to Arnold's insight that underlying this struggle is a us and them orientation. My God is the only God or the better God. First thing to acknowledge when you said, Arnold, that it's hardwired, there's a remarkable study, you can Google it, by Yale pediatricians. I saw it first on 60 Minutes years ago. And these were pre-verbal children who were shown puppets, and they had to pick between two puppets they liked better. And one puppet was identified with the cereal they liked, and the other was with the cereal they didn't like to eat. And they would identify with the puppet that liked their cereal and not like the other puppet. So it's a remarkable study. Again, you can Google how we're hardwired to be group identified with the people who share with us what we like or we're identified with. And the challenge is that's how we're wired. That gets overcome to some degree as people mature and widen the scope of identifications. How you turn a me into a we is the challenge of civilization. And it can be enlarged. And clearly, in ancient times, there was a lot of my God and your God. There's an element of that in the Bible throughout. All nations will come to worship our God. They're going to come to Jerusalem, is part of the mindset. And later that'll be made into more of a metaphor than an actual expectation as such. But that's the challenge. And it's good, as Arnold says, to be aware of the challenge for each of us individually to expand the sense of we. Some other reactions to Psalm 79? Shula? Cantor Shula?
Hey, Tal, am I not on? He doesn't see me.
Oh, Cantor Shula and then Rabbi Podwall. Go ahead. You got to unmute Cantor Shula.
Yes, I was looking at the text, and the words used, particularly in the Hebrew, are so graphic that the mood of it, I feel, is almost the poet is at the moment of literally an emotional meltdown.
Yeah.
In every case, the verbs used and the nouns used are always the harsher choice of the various synonyms. And it's a very, very graphic picture of everything, blood flowing like water, pour your anger, their birds are eating etc.
Yeah.
And then, interestingly, and I've felt that way when I've read this psalm before, it's almost as if the very last verse, 13, was almost tacked on at the end.
Yeah.
Because that is a different mood and maybe even a different writer. I always wished I had been a fly on the wall when the final canonization of the books were made. when the final decision was made, okay, this one gets into the book forever.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if that was almost an addition after the fact to not end on the harsh, emotional anger. Until when, God? What are you doing to us?
Yeah.
And then we say, but we are yours and we love you and we're going to thank you forever.
So that's really importantly said, that 13 is not in the flow of the other 12 verses. The other 12 verses, as Cantor Shula highlights, are filled with anguish and the use of the kinds of images that grab you and shake you up. Blood is flowing, the birds are pecking on the corpses, there is nobody to bury the bodies, and then it closes with kind of sweet words. So some scholars will say it's tagged on, others will say that's the pattern of Psalms. And the context of Psalms is these are conversations with God. You express your anguish, but the context of talking to God to begin with is in the context of a relationship. And by having vented, there's a quality of catharsis and then a reorientation. But do God know we do love you? When I've done this exercise of letters to and from God, which is a way to experience prayer, you write to God a stream of consciousness as if God is listening. What I invariably find is that after expressing one's upset or fears, one tends to step back and say, but thank you, God. I know I don't take for granted what I have. So that's the other way to view verse 13. It's the same writer now stepping back out of the pain, and it's a reoccurring pattern in Psalms. And to sum up, modern scholars will be divided, with some saying it was tagged on by the editors, others saying, no, that's the flow of conversation with God. Last comment, Rabbi Podwal, and then I'll pull it together for today.
Well, as you know, some modern Haggadot do omit Shvo Chamatcha, pour out your wrath, like I believe Mordechai Kaplan's and some contemporary reform ones that I've seen just omit it but instead of explaining it in a historical context, they just leave it out. And as you pointed out, other sources in Jewish tradition, and as you pointed out, the rabbis themselves did not accept the idea of God punishing the children for the sins of the fathers. That's why, the obvious example is on the high holidays and the Shalosh Regalim, when we say Adonai Adonai El Rachum, that verse talking about God's mercy in its original in Exodus talks about, however, God visits the sins of the fathers on the Poked Avon Avot, but the sages just leave it out. They just cut it off the verse because our sages don't no longer accept that view of God anymore.
So let me
could I add one more thing?
Yes, absolutely.
I need to say a Shechianu.
Okay.
Because I saw my first jersey for the Toledo Mud Hens, and I have to thank Arnold. Thank you.
So to respond to Rabbi Podwal, or to amplify the notion of the Shvo, how do we make this relevant to us? Shvo Chamatcha is in the Psalm. It's in the Haggadah. Some would say, and I, for instance, read a paragraph from an Israeli modern kibbutz, a left politically leaning kibbutz, in which the kibbutz member says, I don't want to teach my children hate. This is a paragraph that expresses hate, and I will not say it. So that's not just, if you will, in an American liberal perspective, that's also in an Israeli liberal perspective. There's a discomfort with this kind of energy. And some say that's why I've cut it out. But others, and this is me, why I find it has a place. It does evoke the pain for me of the aftermath of the Holocaust. It evokes for me the pain of our own day in which people are being butchered in places around the world. There is evil in the world. And this paragraph of Shavo Chamatcha can be understood with the gloss, may those who do evil pay a price. May it end. Pour out your wrath. And for me, this is me, to ignore evil is to ignore reality and to fail to respond to the call for divine justice. And sadly, like in the aftermath of the Crusades and the aftermath of the Holocaust, Jews have experienced that up close and personal. And it's the extreme, but it's still present. And it's a call for Elijah. It's a call to God for a world where there is no evil. And for me, again, it's not teaching hatred, it's teaching alertness and responsibility. And the last piece is to say it's evolving how we understand Torah. I cannot relate to a God who punishes children for the sins of his or her parents, including this category of mamzerut, the child who's the pariah. And our rabbis, there is from the biblical to Ezekiel to the rabbis to modernity, what I would agree with Rabbi Podwal as a modern reader, a sense of change where that was viewed more and more metaphorically rather than literally. And what remains is that we are each responsible for our own choices and our own deeds. And so sometimes when reading the past text, I choose to read it metaphorically rather than literally. Or a word like rishonim, it can mean I choose to read it for my earlier wrongdoings rather than for my ancestors' wrongdoings. So in sum, we bring lenses, and there's these three levels, and we're going to revisit them tomorrow with Psalm 80, a psalm called Restore Us, Psalm 81, Blast on the New Moon Shofar this week. And what I want to refocus in on is the mindset of a psalmist speaking to God. And how do we get our own hearts and heads around that experience of talking to God? With that, I invite those to speak with God the words of the Kaddish who would like to do so, honoring the memory of a loved one. One moment. One second. As I now pull up the Kaddish onto the screen. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Bi'alma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute v'chayechon u'vyomechon u'v'chaye dechal beit Yisrael ba'agala u'vizman kari v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam ome'el maya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal Shemei dekucha barichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damiran bi'alma v'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Osei shalom b'imrumav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'kol yoshvei tevel v'imru. Amen. My gratitude to each of you for starting your day with learning together. May it be a day of peace for all of us.